On a personal note, Dr. Alan Ye's work has a huge amount of intersection with the Overseas Ministry Study Center. He is professor of intercultural studies and missiology at Biola University, and a lot of his work on the changing landscape of missiology, his most recent text on polycentric missiology, is a hot topic when it comes to the world church and the different flows of how the gospel is being shared and worked upon. And so it's really a privilege to have him here. I feel like a kindred spirit with him in terms of our studies of the world church and having that intersect with our studies of our own identities as Chinese Americans, not just Asian American. Um, and as has been alluded to in the panel yesterday, Dr. Alanier is truly a Renaissance man. Not only did he do some work on Christianity in China, he actually has a specialization in Latin America as well. He serves on the board of trustees for the Foundation for Theological Education in Southeast Asia, as well as the International Theological Seminary. And so his work spans studies at Yale, at Gordon Conwell, at Edinburgh, as well as Oxford. And so, with all of this experience, not just in books, but also in travel, Alan has been to 64 countries on all six continents in order to study missions and the work of the church around the world. And with that, he really brings just a really diverse set of perspectives. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your take on the struggles and dynamics that are at work within the Chinese American community and how our faith plays into that. So let's give Dr. Ye our applause and our time.
Thank you
Go ahead.
very much. I'm delighted to be with you, and I am going to be presenting my slide here. So, right, my talk is called Christianity as Mediator Between Chinese and Chinese American Migration, Vertical and Horizontal Dimensions of Belonging. So there is actually a lot of resonance, obviously, with so many of the presenters today. I do want to particularly point at David Chow's talk today. He was looking more at theology and ecclesiology. I'm going to be doing something similar, except I'm going to be looking a little bit more politically. Also, just a note, while my lecture is about Chinese versus Chinese American, I will at times be making more general statements about Asians and Asian Americans. So you might hear me go back and forth between these two. And so I'll say Asian or Asian American when I'm being quite general, and because sometimes it is applicable continental wide. And then sometimes I will say Chinese or Chinese American if that is specific to that ethnicity or nation. Okay, uh, moving on. When we think about white Western considerations of belonging, uh, one major difference is, unlike the Asian or Asian American community, is they are usually not as attendant to ethnicity, except monolithically. In other words, you usually don't hear white Western people, whether Christian or not, refer to themselves as Norwegian or German or Irish or anything like that. I mean, they might, but usually they don't. They just can think of themselves as white or white Americans, or even they will drop the white and just think of themselves as just American, right? That's sort of, that is white privilege. That is normality, neutrality. That they occupy the pole position, if you will. And uh, instead, they often think of their considerations of belonging as replaced by nationalism. They might just think of themselves as just American, as I said, or politicization. They might specifically think of themselves as Democrat or Republican, and they will sometimes even vilify the other side as not really American, right? We sometimes hear that. So when they think to be truly American, you have to be one of these political parties, and the other political party they think is not actually American or truly embodies the values of our country. Or they think about it in terms of economics, free market capitalism, or something like that. So, and um, in contrast, Asian Americans will usually, or Chinese Americans will think of their belonging as specifically what type of Asian. Okay, so most Asian Americans are very aware if they are Korean or Hmong or Vietnamese or Filipino or whatever as hyphen with American. So that is something which is very conscious on their mind in terms of their food, in terms of their language. Even if they don't speak the language, they know where the roots of where they came from, and it's a big deal to them. Another is liminality. It means that a lot of Asian Americans are bicultural, bilingual, intergenerational, right? So these things are very much a part of the makeup of Asian Americans, unlike white Americans. Uh, but the problem is we too often parrot the white left right political spectrum, right? So this is why I said this is similar to David Chow's lecture, except instead of he was talking about theology, I'm talking about politics here. And so we will map ourselves onto left or right politics, but those come from very different situations. Those come from historical things that the white community has struggled with, and not necessarily the Asian American community. Or the alternative is that sometimes we reject both. So sometimes Asian Americans will just pair Democrat or Republican, but sometimes we'll say we don't want either one of those. But then we don't really have a good alternative. Okay. We don't want to be too white, but we also don't want to be too Asian. And so there is this struggle that we face in between. And so Asian Americans often opt for a third choice. Now, I want to actually refer to African American scholar Charles Gilmer, who wrote a book called A Cry of Hope, A Call to Action, Unleashing the Next Generation of Black Christian Leaders. And in this, he outlines the ABCs of people of color. Now, this could very easily apply to Asian Americans as well. A is assimilated. The sort of way of saying this is whitewashed. B is bicultural, which means you try to straddle both sides. And C is contextualized, which means you really try to own your Asian background or your context. Okay, and so the problem here is that even within Asian Americans, we battle among ourselves about this. I mean, as Sujin alluded to, or she mentioned that sometimes the C, the contextualized Asians, will look at the A's and say, "You're a Twinkie, you're a banana, right? You're yellow on the outside, you're white on the inside." And then the A's will look at the C's and say, "Well, you are FOB, right? Fresh off the boat, because of the way you dress or the way you talk or whatever." And then there's the B, the bicultural, which seems like they have the best of both worlds, but sometimes they're actually rejected by both sides. I try to be B as much as possible. I speak Chinese and I speak English and I try to eat both foods and I feel comfortable in navigating both countries. But, it's hard when I'm in the United States and people look at me and say, "Well, you must be from somewhere else." The perpetual foreigner mentality. Where are you from? Right? That question that we always get. And I'm like, "I'm from here," but they don't understand or buy that. And then when I'm in China, people know that I'm not from China because of the way I speak or dress. And so they ask me where I'm from, and I say I'm from the United States. And they don't understand that either because they say from the media, all we see is that Americans are white or black. We never see Asians in the media. And therefore, they think that I can't be from the United States. And so bicultural sometimes feels like you're part of both worlds, but part of neither. And so the third choice, you can try to be bicultural. Sometimes Asian Americans opt to be more like white Democrats or progressives. Okay, so I see a lot of Asians who but don't want to be white conservative, and so but they end up being white Democrat or white progressive, and then I feel like you're still being white though, right? You're still not being Asian. And then the third option, funnily enough, is African American. Okay. And so sometimes Asian Americans don't want to be bicultural or white Democrat or progressive. So they opt for African American. We see this with Eddie Huang in Fresh Off the Boat, that sitcom, but it was based on his life story. And I've actually met him before. And, you look at the music he listens to, the way he dresses is all African American. And, nothing wrong with that. But it is the problem is none of these third choices are actually Asian American. Right. And, I think about this in church a lot of times. They'll have multicultural worship sometimes in some churches in the United States who are really trying hard. Right. So they'll have like a white 16th century Reformation hymn. And then they'll do black gospel music. And then they'll do a song in Spanish. And then they get to the Asians and they're like, we don't know what to do with your worship, right? Like you're not going to have like, worship music with pentatonic scales, right? So it's like, what do you do with that? And then some of you may have seen recently the Netflix TV show Beef. And there's this one scene in it where Steve Yeun, the actor, he's who grew up in the church, and he does this very authentic thing where he's singing this worship song in church with tears streaming down his eyes, but he's singing a Chris Tomlin song, right? And that feels like there is no Asian American worship because we either have to go full Asian or we just go white. And so where do we belong? What is that option? And it feels like a lot of times Asian Americans have to either be TGC, the Gospel Coalition, or PACT, which is the Progressive Asian American Christians. And I would say, well, I don't know that either of those extremes completely embody, what Asian Americans are or can be. Those still occupy white spaces or white uh, right or left political spectrum kind of perspectives. Okay. So I'm going to propose a fourth choice in this presentation, Christian Asian American. Okay, but more on this later. And I also recognize that the number 4 is considered historically bad luck or culturally bad luck in Asia, but we're Asian Americans, so that's okay. Okay, so uh, let me talk about examples of how the Western left-right political paradigm does not work in Asia. Okay, Nancy Pelosi, former House Speaker, Democrat, recently supported Taiwan. She went to visit Taiwan, really made mainland China mad, right? But China is more left or communist than Taiwan, and so it's interesting that someone who's more left in the United States would support government that might be considered more right in Asia. That's because these paradigms don't neatly line up, right? In contrast, Elon Musk, a conservative or a fiscal conservative at least, cozies up to mainland China because of his fiscal policies, right? Um, and another example is conservative American Christians tend to support Chinese house churches over the governmental three self-patriotic movement churches, even though the house churches are illegal and rebel against the government, right? You think that conservative American Christians would always say like obey the government, right? And then yet they're supporting this sort of rebel movement, right? Meanwhile, progressive Asian American Christians tend to support the TSPM. And so this gets really complicated because when you support um, the TSPM, and then that sort of destroys this underground movement, which actually flourishes because of the egalitarianism of women leaders, right? So there's this like sort of side effect which may not be recognized. And then if you support the Chinese Communist government, implicitly you're actually supporting Western ideology because they are Marxist, right? And so also that is implicitly condoning human rights abuses such as the Uyghur concentration camps and the annexation of Tibet and the suppression arrest of the house churches. And so, when you dig deeper, you find that sometimes the left is actually supporting ideologies that they wouldn't have supported if they saw the implications of this, and same with the right. Okay. And so, a third bullet point here is question. And this is something that David Chow also mentioned similarly is the Pentecostal Indian Christian, for example, who immigrates to the US, evangelical as we understand it, right? Can you rightly map that onto white American evangelicalism? Or does the PCUSA in Korea fit the Western definition of mainline? And this sort of ecumenical versus evangelical spectrum doesn't really work within Asian Christianity. Okay. Fourth bullet point, Western Christians love to debate egalitarianism versus complementarianism. But interestingly, Asian Christians are often more patriarchal and at the same time also have more female church leaders. So if you talk to them, they're like, we don't even understand this egalitarian versus complementarian debate, right? So it does not neatly map. A fifth thing I want to bring up is I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Jackson Wu controversy. Okay, so just in case you don't know about this, Jackson Wu is actually a white American. His real name is Brad Vaughn, but he was a missionary in China for many years, and he actually used this pseudonym. And part of it was to, missionaries often will do this to hide from the communist government. And so, and he would actually, but he's became pretty famous after a while, and he wrote books under the name Jackson Wu. And then most recently, he actually criticized a book by Mektis Hadis. She is an Ethiopian American. She wrote a book called A Just Mission, and he criticized this. And but the problem is, when it came out that he was actually a white American, then he was accused of cultural appropriation, using an Asian name. And IVP actually just released a statement because his book and also Mektis Hadis's book came out under IVP, um, that uh, they actually will be actually burning all of Jackson Wu's books and supporting Mektis Hadis. And what's really interesting is that Asians in Asia support Jackson Wu or Brad Vaughn. They don't see it as cultural appropriation, but Asian Americans really think this is bad. And so again, it shows that the two sides of the Pacific look at this thing quite differently. Okay. Uh, Many Asian American Christians will be against perceived patriarchalism or Confucianism of Asia, but does this mean we are being Western imperialists and not respecting Asia's culture, right? So I see sometimes uh, progressive Asian American Christians who will say, oh, we don't like Confucianism because it is patriarchal. But is that actually taking a Western viewpoint and destroying traditional Asian culture, which is imperialistic, right? So then that means the left is being somewhat imperialistic, right? And then the issue of LGBTQ, this really gets complicated because the left in America tends to support LGBTQ and POCs, people of color, but in Asia and also a lot of Christians around the world in non-Western countries are actually more traditional with their view of LGBTQ, and they are POCs, right? So it gets very confusing. Do you support them or do you not? Because it just does not neatly map out. So, all right. I was just trying to paint with the last slide the complicated nature of simply using a left-white political binary for Asian Americans. It doesn't quite work. Okay, because bicultural people ultimately have multiple belongings, right? Rich Viodas, who is the pastor of New Life Fellowship Church in Queens, which is they say it's the most multi-ethnic zip code in America, outlines the further dynamics of an immigrant or ethnically diverse church. And I even though this is not specifically about Asian Americans, I think this is instructive. He says there are conservatives who obviously want to keep things the same. They see very little wrong with America, or maybe they want to restore what was, make America great again, right? Progressives who see very little right with America and want to change things a lot. Then you have the grateful immigrants. Okay, so this is where he nuances it. He says the first two are not the only way to see it. You have to have the grateful immigrant, which is the third kind. And he said, for example, Cubans in Florida or Cuban Americans in Florida, right? One thing I sometimes wonder about Florida is why are they so Republican if there's so many Hispanics there, right? We have this stereotype that Republicans are anti-Hispanic or anti-immigrants or whatnot, not, and this explains it, right? You have so many Cubans in Florida who escaped from Cuba, and Cuba is a leftist government, right? And so they come to the United States and they are just grateful. They say, we have just escaped the most horrific thing. Anything here is better than what we had back there, right? And so they tend to lean very right in the United States, even though they are Hispanic. So that is the narrative of the grateful immigrants. Um, and then fourthly, there's the apolitical spiritual, which says we just want to love Jesus. We just want to be Christian. We don't care about politics. We're strangers and aliens in this world, and we just don't need to be any part of that, right? So it's really interesting that there's these four different dynamics when it Uh, White Christians might just be the first two, but when it comes to immigration and people of color, you could have four of those. Daniel Lee at the Asian American Center at Fuller Seminary, he a great book just came out. He outlines the four characteristics of being Asian American. And he says, what does it mean to be Asian American? Because we're so diverse and there's so many different experiences. But he says, number one, we have to have Asian heritage, right? So a recognition of where we come from, our roots. Even if we don't eat the food or speak the language, we recognize where we came from. And it is part of our identity. Second, migration experience. So there is the recognition that you're sometime in the near past, if not for yourself, there was some sort of movement across the Pacific. Third, American culture, because obviously we are here, we are rooted here, and so we're inevitably framed and shaped by here. And then, fourthly, racialization. So we are pegged as one of the big four, ethnicities in the United States: white, black, Asian, and Hispanic. Right. Of course, there's also Native American, and also, of course, Hispanic is not actually an ethnicity, because this is why you always see on the census, like, are you white but not Hispanic, or you know, Hispanic but not white, or because it's not actually a race or ethnicity, but we lump it into. So we get pegged into one of these four groups in the United States. So again, it's showing the complicated nature of being Asian American. And Adrian Pay, who wrote a book called The Minority Experience, says that ethnic minorities in the United States often are characterized by pain, because of what they've experienced here, a lot of suffering and a lot of struggle. Power, being subject to the people in power or in trying to rise up to power, and then also their past. They're very cognizant of their histories. And so this is something which is sometimes white Americans, especially on the conservative side, will just say past doesn't matter, right? They only say the only thing that matters is the present. But of course, the past matters. And we are very aware of our past and where we came from. So it's not just where we came from in terms of geography, but it's also where we came from in terms of our history. So, and everything in the past impacts the present. Okay. Um, I want to talk about this quote in Latin America, and as Easton was saying, that I actually studied Latin America a lot. That was the subject of my PhD dissertation. There's a funny phrase: liberation theologians chose the poor, but the poor chose Pentecostalism. So, in other words, sometimes I feel like those of us who are on the uh, up in the ether, who study these things, are not really on the ground where the people are and where the rubber meets the road. Sometimes people, we academics can tend to say, have these highfalutin, categories, and it's not actually a reality on the ground. Okay. So I feel like we need to be very aware of the reality on the ground. We could easily, again, put it in the left-right political paradigms and just say, well, if you're um, on the right, therefore you're anti-immigrant, and just go from there. And that's an oversimplification of things. It's much more complicated on the ground, right? Again, somebody may be a grateful immigrant, other people may be fiscal conservatives. So there's some people think that Republican equals Christian, and so there's so many reasons for why people of color may actually vote Republican, other than simply whether or not they love Donald Trump or anything, right? So there's we need to dig deeper and see really what people are thinking, and then of course age matters. So because I think sometimes Asian Americans who are older versus younger may see things differently as well. So I want to talk about this case of the New Yorker versus Bloomberg. So the New Yorker magazine actually came out a few years ago, came out with this article castigating Chick-fil-A, because Chick-fil-A opened up the largest restaurant in the world of Chick-fil-A in New York City. And so the New Yorker wrote an op-ed about this and said, that this really is horrible because Chick-fil-A represents anti-LGBTQ. It represents this Christian fundamentalism. How dare they open up their largest restaurant in New York City, which is a bastion of liberalism, etc. And then Bloomberg responded with an article by Stephen Carter, who is an African American professor of law at Yale University. And Stephen Carter said, this is a misunderstanding of what this is. He says, if you look around the world, it is actually uh, not white conservatives that you're blasting. If you're blasting Christians, you're actually blasting a lot of Africans because a lot of Africans are actually sort of more morally conservative on these sorts of matters, right? So again, it really messes with our paradigm if we simply just do the left-right political spectrum. So this is a very interesting back and forth between the New Yorker and Bloomberg. So and so all this is to say, and Sungchan Rob recently posted this: being a person of color at a predominantly white institution is exhausting, exhausting, right? So, and you look at this. I just screenshotted this, but look at the 517 reactions, 155 comments, and I scrolled through the comments, and like almost 100% of them are like, yes, absolutely. And so, and it's interesting because, you think whether you're at a place like Fuller Seminary where Soong-Chan is, right, which I would put on the more progressive evangelical side, or Biola. I mean, even more so at Biola for me, where I'm on the more conservative evangelical side, or even a place like Princeton, which is definitely more progressive than either. Uh, I think this statement is true, right? Doesn't matter where on the political spectrum you fall. If you are a POC at a PWI, it is exhausting because the paradigms do not match. They do not map onto our experience, and we always have to fight against that and say, "Well, this is my story," and then they want to impose their story on our story. Right? It doesn't work. So, um, and when we talk about this, we really what brings to mind is intersectionality. The Apostle Paul mentions at least four categories: race, gender, class, and age. And I gave the verses from Ephesians and Colossians. Anne Zaki, who works for InterVarsity, suggested these major considerations. She said also we need to think about one's personality type, one's gender distinctive, cultural norms, age characteristics, and generational trends. All of these things play into how we have our perceptions. And so let me just say that I came across this thing called the political compass, which I think is a better Western paradigm. Even for Westerners, I think this sort of left right spectrum doesn't work very well because you have economics and you have politics, and these need to be separated or at least considered differently. Okay. So you have economic left, you have economic right, you have authoritarian, and you have libertarian. And so you have countries like North Korea, which might be on the top left. That's the red quadrant, right? And so they're authoritarian in terms of their dictatorship as well as economically left. But then you have the blue quadrant on the top right, which might be more like China, mainland China, because although they are authoritarian, they are more economically right. They're free market capitalists practically, right? And then on the green on the bottom left, countries that are more economically left but more libertarian might be like Scandinavian countries, right? And sort of socialist. And then on the bottom right, libertarian right and economically right might be more like the United States. Okay, so I saw this political spectrum and then I had this idea. Then I said, for Asian Americans, we need to have a similar quadrant, except it needs to not be politics and economics, but it needs to be more like Asian versus American. In other words, which side of the Pacific do you come from, right? Or how close are you to which side of the Pacific? The Asian being on the top and the American being on the bottom, and the Democrat being on the left, the Republican being on the right. Maybe I shouldn't even say Democrat or Republican because that's still imposing sort of a white paradigm on this. But you get what I'm saying. This is why my talk is entitled both vertical and horizontal considerations of belonging. And so This is why often there's so much dissonance between different types of Asian Americans because we need to not only say, well, are we left or right, but we also need to say if we are more of the Asian side or more of the American side as we straddle the trans-Pacific realities, right? And so different people can slot into different ones of these quadrants. And so I think that if we can do that, we can actually have a more nuanced paradigm through which to talk to each other, right? So ultimately, I see Christianity as the bridge or the solution because, we need to not do these three choices. We need to not parrot white Western Christians, right? Whether right or left. We need to not double down on our Asianness because we're Asian Americans, right? We're not from Asia, but we do need to dialogue well with those from Asia. And third, or we need to not become African American or any other POCs. Again, nothing wrong with that, but that's not us. We're Asian Americans. So how do we think of who we are as Asian Americans? So sorry, I said these three choices, but ultimately we need to all of this wrapped up is to not put our politics before our Christianity. So so the fourth choice I alluded to earlier is to be Christian Asian American, not just Asian American. Uh, my wife is actually ethnically Jewish. And when we got married, I realized how many resonances we have with each other, right? I mean, Jewish and Chinese, there's like so many commonalities. We both value academic excellence, both value, hard work, both value like classical music. I mean, you think of like Yo-Yo Ma and Itzhak Perlman, right? Uh, and when I was I did my undergrad at Yale University. I played violin. I swear the entire Yale Symphony Orchestra was either Asian or Jewish, right? So it's like and then both sides also just really value, getting a deal, right? When you're shopping, but also business minded and think there's just a lot of resonances. But ultimately, what I'm really getting down to here is Christianity can actually be such a bridge and a resonance with our Chineseness. Okay. And we need to ultimately let Christianity shape our Asianness or our Asian Americanness instead of letting our Asianness or Asian Americanness shape our Christianity. Andrew Walls, in his book, The Missionary Movement in Christian History, says that all Christians have two identities. We have the indigenizing principles, which is that we are rooted in a specific history and a culture and can only theologize from our situatedness. And yet, the pilgrim principle is that we are aliens and strangers in this world, and we're part of the city of God, and we have a new identity. The thing is, we have to hold in tension both of these. And I think that sometimes the political right only does the pilgrim principle and the political left only does the indigenizing principle. Okay. So ways that Chinese and Chinese Americans can be reconciled via reciprocity. And what I mean by this is if Christianity is the bridge between Chinese and Chinese Americans, the trans-Pacific realities, then we need to recognize that people in the first century Jews were sojourners. They were pilgrim people who uh, often moved to a promised land or searching for a better place, or it's fleeing slavery. They are bicultural, right? So the Bible is very Greek and Hebrew at the same time, and sort of navigating both realities, honor, shame. And I think especially with Gen Z in the United States becoming ever more honor, shame reality, and filial piety, which is in the Bible, honor your parents, right? And so, and oh, you know what? This is sort of funny. My little icon is blocking the fifth point down there, so I can't even see it. But regardless, I'm going to land the plane here. This is what I see as the solution. Christianity, I think too often we've used Christianity as our tool to support our politics. But I think that we need to actually use Christianity as the solution to bridge the trans Pacific divide. Thank you.